What would you say if someone told you that a highly intelligent extraterrestrial being was working as an operative within the US government, that they had been there for several years, and that this man is originally from the planet Venus? What would you say then if you learned that this were not the only case where extraterrestrial beings have contacted, worked alongside, and had continual relationships with human beings? I'm Aaron Deese, and I'm joined by Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Seth Breedlove. This is UFOs Revisited. So we're going to be talking about a couple of cases in particular that have a central theme that I think is really interesting, and I'm curious to see where this takes us. But Seth, what can you tell us about Valiant Thor?
Yeah, well, I've done a deep dive on this because I'd heard the name Valiant Thor. I had not really familiarized myself with the story. So fascinating stuff. Basically, 1957, this guy claims to have landed on Earth. An alien from the planet Venus, as you said, somehow gets mixed up with the Pentagon, and there's a number of authors who've written books about it, which is something I want to dive into because I'm more fascinated by the people who were doing books on this subject than the actual main players, such as Valiant Thor himself. This character of Thor is still said to be around today. I don't know where else to go from there.
Oh, Valiant Thor is still lurking out there somewhere in the annals of the Pentagon.
Yes.
You know, the story that Frank Stranges tells is a colorful one. I think you'd agree, Seth. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the way that the author describes this, Thor drops down and he is met by security officials there in Washington who naturally are a little disturbed by the fact that this man drops down claiming to be from Venus and, you know, pulls a take me to your leader. And they do. They take him to Ike Eisenhower, who seems to yet again be at the very center of all of these stories of alleged contact. And rather than being concerned about potential hostilities, Eisenhower says, "Welcome." And he greets him warmly and says, "I have a good feeling about you, sir." And so they begin to talk, and Valiant Thor is asked, "Is there any way that you could prove to us, you know, where you're from?" And Valiant Thor asks Ike, "Well, what could I do that would constitute proof? You know, what would you accept as proof?" And Ike says, being the leader of the free world as he is, "I don't know." And so at that point, Thor kind of says, "You know, what if I took you back to my ship and I show you my spacecraft? I mean, surely that would constitute proof." Now, you'd think, of course, this is like the moment. The President of the United States says, "Okay, I get to see an actual scout craft from Venus." But he says to Thor, "Let's do that some other time. For now, let's gather together and get to know each other." And they do. I mean, like the way that Stranges tells this story, it's this warm meeting. He's offered proof, but Ike says, "Let's just talk a little bit. Let's get to know each other. Stay with us for a while. We've in fact procured quarters for you." And that's exactly what happens. Valiant Thor hangs around for about 3 years. Now, presumably over those 3 years, the evidence that Ike would have needed is produced. As Valiant Thor in his six-fingered hand and all of these other kinds of extraordinary capabilities he has, you know, this mental prowess that's beyond any earthly genius, it's all revealed. Yeah, it's quite a colorful story that Stranges presents us. And like you mentioned, he's a very colorful character even today in the annals of UFO research.
Can we talk a little bit about who he is and his background and kind of the roots of this story? Because I'll admit that I'm not as familiar with Stranges.
Stranges is, this is where I found a lot of fun in looking into this guy because he claims to have been numerous things. He says he has many degrees. I can't even count all the degrees he claimed to have. He called himself a doctor. He was also known as a reverend, an author, obviously. Perhaps most suspiciously, he claims to have been an FBI agent at some time. Now, the problem with the FBI agent claims that I've been able to find is that he was claiming to be an FBI agent only in his talks. He did not do this in writing. because they would have evidence that he had claimed this. So in his talks, he would refer to himself as having been with the FBI and an agent. The FBI has a full-blown file on him that there's over 56 pages of reports in it. And a lot of these reports were looked into by the FBI because people were contacting them to complain about Strange's and his claims of having been with the FBI. There's very little in there about UFOs. It's mostly about his outlandish claims. So the first thing I thought of when I started looking into Strange's was Gray Barker. He just has that same air about him, and the work that he did, having read a little bit of the book, has a Barker vibe to it. It's kind of outlandish. It's a little out there. I also found an odd similarity, or an odd coincidence, I guess, that the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still came out in 1951. This case in 1957. He even refers to this book being basically like a real life Day the Earth Stood Still. But he's a very interesting guy. Ran a group. He initially was asked to do an interview with it was like the LA Times or something, LA Weekly, and he claims at the time to be an investigator for NICAP. NICAP flips out. They don't want this man speaking on their behalf, so they immediately send around, letters to publications to let them know this man is a member of NICAP, but is not an investigator for us, so we do not vouch for him. So he turns around, starts his own organization, which the name is almost identical. You might know it. I can't remember what it is, but it's almost identical to NICAP. It's like it almost has the exact same letters, abbreviation. So, and he was around, I don't know what year he died, but it wasn't too long ago. And he was into UFOs right up until the time of his death. I will say his wife vouches for him and claims to have also met Valiant Thor on numerous occasions, which I found interesting. And some parallels there with the Derenberger situation, the Woody Derenberger injured cold situation, because the family also vouches for Derenberger.
Strange's, I think, also was associated with an organization called like the California State Marshals Association, which on that point, it led to an interesting exchange I had with Brian Dunning of Skeptoid, who was really nice. We actually emailed back and forth because in his article about this, obviously Brian and I, and this is a big spoiler alert, but I think Brian and I are both of the mind that Strange's wasn't telling the truth about that. That might shock some people, but what was interesting is I did find some newspaper articles that referred to a California State Marshals Association or some similar organization, and that they had been providing support for some political candidates. And Dunning had initially said that he couldn't find any evidence that organization exists. So we ended up finding that there were references to said organization. I guess the real question is, and this is what Brian wrote back to me as well, but was Strange's necessarily a member of that or associated with it any more than he was NICAP or the FBI or any of these other organizations he claimed and actually had not been associated with? It's fascinating that, and you do see this a lot in UFO lore, where people sometimes make repeated, extravagant, extraordinary claims which should completely nullify anything that they have said, and yet their stories somehow kind of gain foothold, as we've discussed. Phil Schneider, he does revive Valiant Thor, and he tries to work that into his own mythos, and others have too. So it's kind of funny that despite all the questions about Strange's and his affiliations and everything, Valiant Thor kind of took on a life of its own, almost like a tulpa. He's out there. He's still around today. And
I think it's important. Strange's, he's an evangelist Christian. He has a message. It's a warm message. Believe it or not, Valiant Thor, he's out there. He wants to do good for our world, for the planet, for humanity. So whether you want to believe that there's a Valiant Thor or you don't, it's a warm message and a way to get the story out to the people, and let's save the planet, let's put down our nukes, let's be kind to one another. And I think that is part of what Strangest was trying to get out there, that message for the people and humanity.
right? He almost becomes a cult leader because there's a little religion built around this idea of I come in peace and we can change through the benefit of our extraterrestrial brotherhood.
Right.
Well, it's a weird theology though that he's pushing, because when it's a blend of Jesus Christ, Christianity with Space Brothers from Beyond, and he's got Valiant Thor talking about how they have a direct contact with Jesus Christ on Venus that basically makes it so they don't need the Bible. But he's very much about like that message of Christianity, but it's like it's almost there, but it's just not quite all the way. And then he takes it in some odd directions. Reading about him and even listening to some interviews, I couldn't quite figure out which, not version of Christianity, but it's Christianity, but it's filtered through a very odd lens, which if you look at that time period, the contactee movement, a lot of them were doing similar things. There's the Christian message, but it's got a Space Brother aspect to it.
Yeah, not only that, but by sprinkling in the name Thor, you also have this pagan aspect as well, too.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting how so many aspects of it kind of borrow from various mythologies, and on that Christian side of things too. I mean, fun kind of parallel there with George Adamski. Adamski later comes out with the co-authored book with Desmond Leslie, where he talks about his meeting with, I believe it was also a person from Venus, who comes down, a space brother in a flying saucer. But then a whistle was blown years later when Ray Fowler, not Ray Fowler, it was Ray Palmer, who had been the publisher of Amazing Stories magazine for a time, and of course left that magazine to go co-found Fate magazine with Curtis Fuller. Palmer ended up saying, look, I've got to tell you, I knew that name Adamski because before that book came out and was published and told this true story of a flying saucer, he said that book came to my desk and I saw that manuscript, and before the flying saucer wave, begins in 1947, Adamski had pitched that manuscript at us, but it was not a flying saucer, it was just a spacecraft, just kind of a, nondescript spacecraft, and instead of it being a man from another planet, it was Jesus Christ on that spacecraft who comes down with this message of peace, love, light, brotherhood, right? Again, that trope like you're talking about, Katie. So, yeah, that was something that you saw a lot. And it seems to almost sort of signal this move toward a flying saucer religion, in the sense that as we're coming out of the Second World War, I mean, plenty of Americans then and today still held and hold Christian values, but we started seeing people trying to kind of fuse those two. The religious idea with the saucer idea, and this as being like the coming of the second coming, perhaps in this case, of at very least people who seem to hold similar ideals, and that this was like a message of hope in a very dark time.
So the idea of Jesus Christ as an alien is not just limited to this particular region. I mean, this is something that we've seen out of Germany as well.
I think whenever you look at it from a modern perspective, if we look at some of the ancient, manuscripts or the artwork and even the Bible itself, there is definitely an astronomical element to the birth of Christ. He's announced by a star, right? We have angels descending and talking telepathically to people, all very reminiscent of rather modern UFO tales. And there's also the idea, too, that we humans are so corrupt that we could possibly not give salvation, that it has to come from someplace else. I mean, you can take with it what you will. I mean, I'm a practicing Catholic, but I look through all different types of perspectives. But the idea of religion forming around this particular idea means that not everyone is seeing this person as a lunatic, right? He also is giving us a message, right? So I think it's all fun and games to kind of laugh at him and tongue in cheek and stuff like that. But other people are taking this very seriously.
What's interesting is you have religions that are built up around Jesus Christ, and there's multiple denominations built around that. Is ufology heading in the same direction to a certain degree? And then to see the marriage of it back in what would that time period be, from the 50s through probably the 70s, right? where they're marrying the religion with ufology, the Christianity with ufology. It's just a very specific thing to that time period, I think. I know that there are still religions that, you know, have a space brother aspect to
And
them.
there are definitely sects to it as well too. Look at the idea of the Heaven's Gate, where you could only purify yourself by castrating yourself, and then they committed suicide. So that's an extreme idea on how UFO cults could work as well.
Well, often the dialogue we hear, or the message we hear from these UFO contactee cases, even if they're not making that religious correlation, has something to the effect of, I come in peace, I'm not here to harm you. We've mentioned it on this show before, but when angels or entities appear in the Bible, they often start out by saying, don't be afraid. That's basically the same message. I come in peace, don't be afraid. So there's an interesting parallel there, even taking it from an ancient context to a modern context. We see this message repeated. I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of anything being from Venus and being on Earth for a moment, because it's, we have Valiant Thor, and then we have this other case, so it's not the only anecdote about something from Venus. Thor was alleged to live for 400 plus years, was alleged to be human looking with 6 fingers and 6 toes, was believed to have 1 oversized heart and 1 giant lung, had copper oxide for blood like an octopus, an IQ that was off the scale with a 1200 IQ, and apparently spoke over 100 languages fluently, some of them alien, non-terrestrial languages. How we would know if they were languages or just gibberish, I don't know. But again, let's talk about Venus for a second. What do we know about Venus?
You're grain, and the gravity is much different. I think it's a very hostile environment, and for somebody who looks like Valiant Thor, unless he's way underground at the core, I don't know how he's surviving there.
Yeah, besides the moon, Venus is the brightest object in the night sky, and the reason for that is because it has cloud cover. There's something on there called the runaway greenhouse effect. So everything that's going on there is kind of like covered up, so there's no release of any of this stuff. So yeah, sulfuric rain, 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly right. Just not a great place to vacation.
So if something were living there, living on the surface, there's no way that it's coming here and going to look like this man in this picture.
Mm. That's right.
It is important to note that he claimed to live inside the planet.
Okay.
Oh, that should
So we're good. I think you guys need to be aware of that and give Valiant Thor his credit for living in the core.
All right, that's what I was going to ask, because that's an important element too. If he has 6 figures, right, that was something that was synonymous with a Nephilim, correct? The idea of an extra digit. So was that something that he was playing around with as well?
The number 6 has religious connotations as well. If we look at the book of Revelation and God created man on the 6th day, man's day, whatever, there's different interpretations of that, but that may be nothing, but that's interesting to me.
Can we jump back to the fact that I'm unclear on when Schneider got his hands on this story, because to me it starts with Stranges, right? And then at some point Menger has it, because he's involved in this as well, and then Barker later adapts his own version of events for a book.
Maybe could we talk about that a little bit? Menger and Barker's connection to Valiant Thor? Yeah. Well, I mean, well, I was hoping you would. And we've reached an impasse.
So Menger used to do basically like revivals essentially at his farm, and supposedly Valiant Thor shows up for one of these, impresses the heck out of the congregation or audience, whatever you want to call it, cult members, by speaking in numerous different languages. Supposedly any language they would ask him to speak, he could speak in. And so he impresses everybody with his language skills. What I'm confused about is when that happened versus when Strange's version of events is unfolding, or if they're intertwined. Because again, I haven't read this whole book yet.
I would have to imagine that probably Strange's, brings the story to light, and then I guess most of the claims, obviously Phil Schneider probably being one of the most recent, these are appropriated by other authors, and Gray Barker too, like you mentioned. Here's an interesting question. Where does Lanulos come into the equation?
That's where we're going to go next, is that this is not the only case where people alleged to have had contact and continual contact with alien beings. Seth mentioned it a little while ago. So let's talk about this other case. What do we know about Indrid Cold and Woodrow Derenberger?
So Indrid Cold, November 2nd, 1966, Woodrow Derenberger is driving down the highway and claims to observe this object that's kind of blocking the road in front of him. It's hovering over the highway. A door opens, according to some accounts, in fact, a being is seen opening the door for Cold. He wasn't alone. A very strange name. This individual comes over to the window and introduces himself, but how he does this to Mr. Derenberger is he telepathically kind of projects through the window, roll down your window.
Why do you need to roll down a window?
If you're going to communicate telepathically, right? So Derenberger complies and he rolls down the window, and this man is standing there. His lips don't move, but he's kind of smiling. And he's got his black hair slicked back and he's wearing a long coat. And he says, my name is Cold. Derenberger doesn't really understand at first. He says, "You're Cold?" He says, his name is Cold. And he essentially just says a few things to him like, "Don't be afraid. You have so many more armaments than I do. You could overpower us." And he just essentially kind of speaks to him telepathically for a few minutes and then says, "You'll meet me again. We'll be back in touch." And then Mr. Cold leaves the scene. Now, about 48 hours later, Derenberger, being very disturbed by all of this, is driving down the road with a friend this time, and then they say he starts with his hand kind of to the back of his head, and he comes all the way over his head and down over his face, and he just finally is sitting there holding his chin and starts saying, "Flight, flight, flight, ship, ship, ship," and starts almost like he's channeling something. And his companion begins to interpret this as though Derenberger is actually reading something. He starts to actually have trouble pronouncing certain words as though he's literally trying to read something he's being shown. And then he eventually kind of passes out, and so the friend fortunately is able to reach across, hit the brake, and steer the car safely off the road as Derenberger kind of goes comatose. He later says that what he is seeing is the road, and he's aware of everything that's happening, but he is communicating with Indrid Cold, who is somewhere nearby, and is advising him as he's driving, "Keep your eye on the road, drive safely, listen," and he imparts more information to him, just, as you'd expect someone to do. "Keep your eye on the road as I imperil you and potentially endanger your friend as well, as I communicate all this to you as you're trying to drive." So, and this was just 48 hours after the primary contact. Derenberger's claims were reported in newspapers around that time. They were initially treated pretty credibly. Again, being like a sewing machine salesman, I believe, and 50 years old, well-dressed. They said, this guy doesn't seem like anybody who would make extraordinary claims. And then there were the corroborating witnesses. There were people who claimed to have seen this incident occur. There was a truck driver specifically who days later comes out and says, I saw like a strange craft and it had been on the road, but there was a man parked and someone standing. He was wearing like a knee-length black jacket who was standing by the window, and they appeared to be communicating. So supposedly there was this corroboration that this had all happened. And eventually this leads to NICAP. They sent their top man, Frank Strangus, out to investigate. No, not really. No, NICAP sent investigators to interview Derenberger. And it's important to note that the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena at that time, it was the largest civilian UFO group based out of Washington, D.C., and they were the largest in operation at that time. Although there was also the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which is one of the oldest, and they were kind of the other big group at the time. NICAP sends people out to interview Derenberger, and they initially found him pretty credible. Although NICAP was really careful about talking to contactees. They always kind of kept the contactee claims at arm's length. But as time goes on, Derenberger's claims get a little more extraordinary. Some of the little facts begin to change. Initially, I think he had said that Cold told him he was from a place called Ganymede, right? Not to be confused with, I believe, a moon in association with one of our own planets. Now, he said he came from a planet called Ganymede. Apparently, at some point, this changes to Lanulos. Another fun fact that Derenberger also conveys is that he had a wife. I think her name was like Kimi or something like that, and that he had 2 kids and a third one on the way. So he's in every way very much like just an Earth person, and comes all this way to tell Woodrow Derenberger that, I'm pretty much just a normal guy just like you. He shows up at Derenberger's home on one occasion, allegedly, and this time he brings his, as he calls him, his patriot, his co-pilot, a guy named Carl. Seriously. And so Indrid, Cold, and Carl come and they stand outside and they talk with Derenberger, who's very excited to see him this time. Oh, wow. And they don't go inside, though, because Derenberger's wife is just allegedly terrified of what's happening outside. And I'm not sure exactly why that would have been the case, but there is this interesting parallel here because Indrid Cold, and in fact there have been some excellent films made by Small Town Monsters that convey this very incident. Indrid Cold with the smile, some have likened sort of to the so-called grinning man.
Yeah, there's other parallels back to Strangest too, in that a pseudo, I don't know if you can call it religion, but it got to the point where people were showing up at their house, the Derenberger's house, in hopes of seeing, Indrid Cold and having some sort of communication with him. They would ask for messages, from Woody that were coming from Indrid, and it got to the point where the police were being called out regularly to dispatch people, to disperse people and get them out of the road because they were hanging out around the house. And this was all built up around Indrid Cold and his frequent visits. Now this didn't stop in 67 or 68. A lot of people kind of close the book on it there. Woody becomes mildly obsessed with UFOs, not just Indrid Cold, but ufology in general. Eventually he and his wife divorce and he moves to Cleveland, where he started going to UFO meetings with a UFO group out of Cleveland. He ends up marrying another contactee, and so he gets remarried. And all through his life, he continued to claim interaction with Indrid Cold, to the extent that I had the honor of interviewing Tanya. But Tanya told me that Indrid Cold attended her father's funeral, and so supposedly he had interaction with the family all the way up through Woodrow's death, which again was fair. I don't know, I can't remember the date, but it was not that long ago either.
Do we have photographs of Mr. Cold?
She told me she had a photograph. I was not shown the photograph. I don't know if there is a photograph out there that anyone's seen.
Yeah, there are a lot of artist interpretations. You're inevitably taken to Instagram and DeviantArt when you go looking.
She told me the exaggerated grin wasn't true. She said he had an awkward grin that he seemed to wear to sort of put people at ease, but it did not seem like something he was naturally doing. When I asked her what he looked like, she said he looked like he had like kind of a Mexican complexion. This is what, in her words, a Mexican complexion, but sort of Asian eyes.
Well, wasn't the grinning part brought in by Keel, comparing him to other grinning man encounters?
Probably. That's an important point, Heather, because again, as NICAP does their report, they eventually say, look, we don't find anything that explicitly, reveals this to be a fraud, but we find the case to be highly dubious. That's kind of what they conclude. And at that point, Gray Barker was sort of injecting propaganda and saying, you can almost rest assured that NICAP is going to be dismissive of this man and his claims. And so, although NICAP kind of lost interest, some continued to sort of champion the story, and John Keel was certainly one of them. And because of that, Indrid Cold kind of enters this entire Mothman mythos, because in the book The Mothman Prophecies, Derenberger, receives a pretty fair treatment by Keel, who maintains sort of a fascination with him, and ends up interweaving Keel, Derenberger's claims and the Indrid Cold thing into something else that Keel borrows from Gray Barker's writings, these mysterious men clad in black suits who show up and intimidate UFO witnesses. Now, he didn't say that Indrid Cold was an MIB. It seems to be strongly implied that Cold, another individual called Apol, or Apple sometimes is how it's pronounced, but all these different people around the time of the Mothman sightings were allegedly having these contacts with, Space Brothers beings, ultra-terrestrials, whatever they might have been. So it is interesting that Keel kind of helped to sort of perpetrate, and maybe without Keel we could even say that Derenberger and his claims and the whole Indrid Cold thing wouldn't really have the sort of interest that it has these days. Keel really kind of helped that along.
The MIB connection is interesting too. The family, the Derenbergers, were visited by Men in Black, supposedly on multiple occasions. And the same can be said for Frank Stranges, who claims he was taken into the desert and beaten by 3 men in black before being rescued by Valiant Thor and some of his Venusian buddies, who show up and eviscerate the men in black. Their words were that they were displaced, but they destroyed them. So apparently the Venusians, despite being our space brothers, are not peaceful people. But I thought that was interesting that they both families claim, or not families, but both major players in these contactee stories both claim contact from the men in black. I think Strange's story is better. Just
Going back to whenever he actually had his encounter, Woody had his encounter, we're talking about Route 77. This isn't like a small backwoods road. He had it. This was a major highway right outside of Parkersburg, right?
Right outside of Parkersburg. 2-lane though at that time.
Was it just 2-lane?
Yeah.
It's still a major highway though for getting north to south. And like you said, there were multiple witnesses. When Keel comes in, he brings in the Grinning Man aspect of it to say that there were other people that had Grinning Man encounters. So it wasn't like a one-off, but the idea of Indrid Cold being very human-like you said, it like he was like one of us, from Lanulos. He had a family. It just made him very human, which I thought was a very interesting aspect of the case.
And was that his message to humanity? Was it like Valiant Thor? Did he have a message he wanted to get out to humanity that, hey, I'm just like you guys? And I think that with both these cases, that's the important thing here, is how are we going to interact with our space brothers? What are their lives like out there, and how do we welcome them? And is it going to be the president? Things like that. So although these stories seem out there in a lot of ways, I think there's an underlying message that is important to examine and look at. Even we're talking 57 and 1966, the message is still the same and relevant today in the 2000s.
What's a weird thing, I want to talk about the context of what was going on in West Virginia during the Derenberger stuff too, but before we get to that, it is interesting that the message of not all, but so many of the contactee cases that are well known today is this one of peace and light, and there's nothing inherently negative about it. It's hard to tell what actually was going on, but it is a strange thing when people say these guys were all just looking to make money off of the contactee movement or by creating their own cult or whatever, because people like Stranges, even Barker, I'm not saying Barker had his own cult build up, but they're all kind of in the same camp. Derenberger, they were not exactly wealthy people their entire lives. So you're talking about making very little money off of, what most skeptics just say is a hoax. So I kind of balk at the idea that this was a money-making scheme. I don't think it's that cut and dried.
Yeah, I think in Gray Barker's case particularly, I think that he was a good storyteller, frankly. If you go back and you read, they knew too much about flying saucers. It was, pretty sensational and well written, and he loved to kind of allude to things and leave it hanging and ominously sort of insinuate that maybe I'll be the next one who's silenced, if you hear more from me, It's like the men in black are literally 3 steps behind him, at all times, and he's the one who's gotten this far and told the story. And Jim Moseley might have been silenced, and all these other people might have been silenced, and they got to Bender first, and all these other, researchers have been silenced. So he definitely enjoyed the storytelling aspect of it. I think that's true. You're right, probably wasn't making very much money off of this, but to an extent, maybe it was also kind of getting the attention, and I think that to an extent that extends to Woodrow Derenberger and the other contactees of the era too. They get a certain degree of attention. Conveniently, when people start showing up at the house and everything, and it gets to be a little out of control, police are having to be called, as the situation calms down, then Derenberger starts saying that, Indrid came back, and this time he took me for a ride, and we've traveled to other planets, and we've been to all these places. But an interesting thing that also comes out of all this, you mentioned the FBI files. One of the reasons that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would have been interested in people at that time who were making claims about contact had been kind of twofold. It really first was the concern that maybe there were actual contacts being made, but the FBI thought that more so than there were literal contacts, it might be that these people are making claims about contact, and it's potentially part of some kind of like subversive movement, right? For instance, a lot of the contactees end up being investigated because the way that the love and light message that the contactees are always talking about, this utopian kind of thing, it had kind of socialistic tones, right? And the FBI was very worried that people might try to start religions or movements that are propagating essentially socialist ideals and using claims of contact and meetings with benevolent space brothers as the means by which that message is conveyed and propagated.
The Cold War is so prevalent through the early era of contactees, and it's all over it. Like, you can see it in every. It almost becomes like the blacklist or what the blacklist in Hollywood. It becomes borderline like that, where they're targeting the FBI, CIA, whatever was around then, are targeting these contactees with surveillance and things like that. It's interesting.
Very interesting.
What I wanted to talk about though with West Virginia that I think is so interesting is the media is so apt to cover that Derenberger story. At that point in time, the UFO sightings were so prevalent around that particular part of West Virginia that the Charleston newspaper, the Gazette, had a UFO desk dedicated to taking UFO reports because they were coming in so frequent. So they were much more open to covering this because this was going on all across West Virginia, but particularly that like Ohio Valley area. So Woody's story comes along and it's like, yeah, this is right in line with everything else we're hearing. Interesting fact though, and this is not a well-known story, but supposedly there was a similar incident that happened in downtown Point Pleasant, broad daylight, near the school, I think the elementary school. Jeff Walmsley, who runs the Mothman Museum, told me the story, that a UFO lands, these beings dressed in coveralls get off the craft and they speak to some teachers at the school and then leave. And it's right around the same time, maybe within a day or two of the Derenberger story. And that's not something I've heard out there. I've never interviewed a witness from that or been able to find out who the actual witnesses were. But it's a story Jeff Walmsley grew up knowing, and he had talked to someone who witnessed the UFO land. So I thought that was an interesting tie to the Derenberger story.
Interesting. So you have another tangential connection to Point Pleasant, the Mothman, and this concentrated hub of high strangeness.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We're letting children get a glimpse, right? That's not the first elementary school sighting. There's a few famous ones.
That's true.
And so I think it's just like, let the children just get a glimpse and see where that goes. I'm always curious about why they would just, not come and introduce and just let people just have little glimpses of them and see where it goes. I don't know. Maybe it's a social experiment.
Yeah, we talked about that a couple times. Maybe some of these things are, and we can make that argument here today, maybe some of these contactee cases are some kind of experiment on the part of maybe a terrestrial power. I don't know, there's a lot of lines of speculation to take there. But it's a fascinating idea, this whole concept of aliens living with and talking to us and continuing these communications long term. I think that's the linchpin for me.
Another element of this story, too, is we always talk about why doesn't a UFO land in the front yard of the White House? In these cases, they are going to the White House, right? They're going to the leader, and nothing comes of it.
All back to Eisenhower.
Well, and that ties back to the day the Earth stood still, which that is a tie that I think is we see this constantly across paranormal phenomena, like purported real events mirroring pop culture, but especially with this Cold War era UFO flying saucer stuff. The films that are coming out are later sort of, you see something comparable claimed to have happened. The Battle of Los Angeles and Earth versus the Flying Saucers. You see, like, it happens constantly throughout pop culture and ufology and Bigfoot and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. That's true. The Red Scare, you're afraid of the other coming in. After the proliferation of nuclear weapons, now radiation becomes part of stories in many cases as well, too. People are radiated or, they have some sort of burns in their body that are reminiscent of radiation burn. So I think that all does come into play, because you cannot have one out of the other. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're all fed information from different areas.
I wish I had more information on where the Venusians, is that how you say it?
Yeah, I guess.
Venusians? Venusians? Where they claim to live inside the core, or inside the Earth. It didn't say in the core, but it said inside of Venus. I'm curious if they had cities, were they just living in bottles down there? How did that work?
Underground complexes, you see, yeah.
Like on Mars, the tunnels, the ant people down there.
Back to Mars.
Lanius is interesting too, because Derenberger eventually, you said about Derenberger, Derenberger claims he was taken to Lanius.
And it was a lot like Earth.
Yeah, what's curious about that story, it originally was called Ganymede, right? In Greek mythology, Ganymede is a human being that was abducted by the gods and taken to their world.
Interesting. That's really, yeah.
That is interesting.
At some point, it becomes Lanulos, which again, that's the tie-in really between this case and Valiant Thor, because that's where Thor was supposedly from, Lanulos, right? At least according to one later retelling, because initially he'd been from Venus. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. At what point was it Phil Schneider that had said that Thor was associated with Lanulos?
See, that I actually don't know.
Right.
That may be one of these things.
Well, Derenberger's writing his own books too, so it might have been that the information that came out initially did not jive with what Derenberger was actually saying, because we see that a lot, especially if Barker, some of these people are involved. The accounts given by the actual witnesses does not jive with what is out in the mainstream at that particular time.
Right. In any case, a part of the parallel being that, we have the initial association with Venus and Ganymede, and then later Lanulos ends up kind of being thrown into the mix. And my suspicion would be that was an embellishment later in the case of Indrid Cold, but something that probably was borrowed somewhat later by one of those who appropriated the Valiant Thor idea. Because fundamentally, a lot of the time what's happening is these characters end up kind of being borrowed, and they make their way into other people's stories, and the mythos builds and grows.
I'm curious, did I don't know this, did Cold ever claim to be interacting with like government officials or anything, or is it just interaction?
Wondering that too.
Yeah, because all I know is from what I've read, which is the first book by Derenberger, but there were multiple. I think there was at least another one that came out afterward, and then Tanya had reprinted that initial book with additions to it. But I'm curious because they couldn't be more different if that's the case. If it's just Cold interacting with the Derenbergers, that's very different from Valiant Thor, who's holed up in the Pentagon and is still working with the government and all that. And what was it about Derenberger that Cold was so fascinated by that he kept coming back to interact with him?
Yeah, basically just said he was a regular guy. Like, I'm fascinated because you're just like me. In a situation.
And I wonder why at that point too, I mean, if there is Thor and why wasn't there a disclosure then? I mean, why didn't they come out and talk to the American people and the world and humanity? Like, why this covert, keep it under wraps? I mean, that's always been a question for me.
The Venusians supposedly had bunkers, or not bunkers, but command centers is what they call them, set up all around the United States. I think there were 66, if I'm not mistaken. And they were monitoring our activities, which doesn't sound malevolent, but it's a very odd aspect to the story.
He showed up, you said, at almost like tent revivals, right? Did you say that Valiant Thor showed up at...
I think Strange said that.
Menger and Strange said he was showing up at like these contacting groups.
Right. So I guess it was up to you to decide whether you wanted to follow or not, that kind of a deal as well. So yeah. But Cole is not completely vanished from the scene. He pops up, he becomes almost a literary stock figure now, where you can almost plug him into anything. And there are some paranormal groups out there right now that are making claims they're being in contact with the Cold.
And Thor is living still to this day at Lake Mead. I mean, I don't know if he's camping or where his ship is. I think his ship can turn invisible, right?
I don't know. Maybe.
I
Sounds
think his
good.
ship is
That works.
invisible.
The names of the other Venusians are great. I think one is actually Tanya, but they're very common Earth names.
And that came to me as we were talking about the period in which this happened. This is just one example I can think of, but Frank Herbert's Dune was published around this time, and you have this really high concept, outrageous sci-fi story about different planets and vast civilizations, and the characters' names are Paul, Jessica. You know, there's some interesting names in there too, but there's a lot of just really normal, regular names. Duncan. You know, I don't know if there's any correlation there, but again, when we're talking about the parallels in art and pop culture, that's another one we can point to.
Indrid's co-pilot was Carl.
Yeah, like it's an interesting, and it's interesting we see that in both of those cases, Indrid and Valiant Thor. So,
English names.
yeah, what's up with that?
You know, that's another good point. That's an excellent point. Yeah, just so we can riff off that for a second. So even if you look at Star Wars, right, all the bad guys speak with a British accent, right? Even if you don't think about that, that's a very pertinent point as well, too, because the way you identify with those folks. So they come from Venus, but they are very American in essence, right? Yeah.
The interesting side note about Cold is like his first appearance is in very early 20th century in New Jersey. He supposedly meets with two young boys, tells them his name is Cold, and he's a very intimidating figure in that story. But that is supposedly the first time Cold is encountered in the United States, for what it's worth.
I think it's worth quite a bit.
Again, that could be an addition that comes along later. You know, that might be something where we're adding to the mythos behind Cold, because he, like you said, he's become an icon of the paranormal world.
The idea of alien contact with human beings is, as we've learned today, an ongoing phenomenon. Whether or not it's true, it forces us to reassess our place in the solar system and how we would interact with beings from outside our world.